Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, today we're going to venture into the very holy, tender, complex, and sometimes I would say kind of war-ravaged places of our lives. We want to talk about marriage and some of the complexity and madness, but possibility, and also the presumptions of what is playing out in our marriages in the midst of a COVID-19 world. And we don't come to this topic lightly. We're aware that statistics of domestic violence, of just some of the dangers and heartache and brokenness in our homes are at such a heightened level right now. So our hope today is really just to bring some encouragement, some honesty and vulnerability and playfulness to the realm of marriage. So I'm here with Dan and Steve. And Dan, I'm going to let you introduce Steve.
Oh, I'm so grateful that I get to introduce one of my dearest friends on the earth, but also my decade-long fly fishing partner. So, Steve, you are the author of a remarkable book on marriage that we'll probably come back and refer to a number of times, but it's called Reconnect: Insights and Tools for Cultivating Meaningful Connection in Your Marriage. And I am privileged to be able to have written the foreword, but this is a sweet, it's just a superb book on marriage. And so, Steve, as we walk into this, one of the things that I have deeply appreciated about you and your life is that you know you're a mess as a human being and as a husband. And I don't fish with people who aren't a mess, and because otherwise they couldn't endure me. But first of all, just ask you to talk a little bit about your marriage, and Lisa.
Well, thank you, Dan and Rachael, first of all, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And it's always a privilege to be in dialogue with you about things that really matter. And marriage matters, obviously. And I don't think we'd be this intentional in talking about kind of the heartache and suffering of where people might be in this moment in time. And, Lisa and I have been married almost 35 years, I think. I always have to pause for some reason. I just can't quite get that second number down. And we're in a place of solace and solitude and I think isolation in terms of our own time with others in the midst of what we're all enduring in this moment in time. But it has created some good moments of connection for us and some moments that have not gone well. So I'm sure we'll move into that a little bit throughout our time today.
Well, that'd be a good place to begin. And that is, what are you discovering about what happens for you in your marriage and what you're finding, because you work with countless couples. And I should also say that Steve and I and Lisa, his wife, Becky, my wife, will be doing an online course this summer, shooting it, available hopefully for you all sometime this fall. But to say, you two, I know how much love there is, but I also know how much honesty there is between the two of you. So what are you discovering about your marriage and about your life and about others as you work with them?
Yeah, I would think it was a few weeks ago where Lisa said, hey, some good friends of ours, some neighbors of ours invited us over for a social distancing bonfire. And which, where we live, we have the space to be able to do that. And I sort of looked at her like, oh, I don't know. And she says, we haven't seen people for nearly 3 weeks. and I looked at her like, really? We haven't? Almost like I hadn't noticed, which did not go well. Lisa loves being around people. She thrives and has so much energy in being with people.
Mm,
And at times I do as well, but not to the degree that she does. And for some of us, that might be a little bit hardwired around, what we might refer to kind of this introverted nature versus extroverted nature. In some way, the isolation has been something of goodness, which is really odd to say.
Mm.
And for us, it has been it only has heightened the awareness of difference between the two of us.
mhm,
That Lisa craves to be with people, loves to be with people, needs to be with people for the majority of her waking hours, and that's not always true for me. And so it has caused and created, I think, for the two of us, some deep moments of tension and conflict. And because I think what most of us, if not all of us, have really endured is that something has been taken from us without voice, without
Mhm.
control, that it has been imposed upon us without a sense of say or any kind of dialogue around what's okay and what might not be okay. It's simply just been required. And so I think that's for many couples, including us, when something has been taken without voice, it just naturally creates tension. It just naturally
mhm,
creates conflict. It just naturally creates this sense of something has been taken from me, whether that's my voice, my time, my work, my environment, my time with people, which for so many couples, I think just time with others is life giving
mhm,
and is a source of comfort and joy. And when there isn't that face to face interaction, which is again how we're hardwired. I mean, we're hardwired for face to face interaction. Yes, with our family, yes, with our spouse, but also with others. And when that has been limited to the degree it has been for all of us, I think that just naturally creates this state of anxiousness and distress. And how we cope with that and endure that is perhaps what we can also talk about. But I think that's been for a majority of the couples that both for Lisa and I, but also for the people I work with, that has been a common area to explore and wonder about and be aware of in the way it impacts one another.
hmm. Well, Steve, my husband and I have been married for a little over 6 months now.
Mm-hmm.
And in our 6 months of marriage, we have gone through a cross country move for myself. I have two stepsons, so also building attachment for a whole new family system, family structure. And let's see,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, what, about 3 months into things, maybe four, COVID arrived on the scene. And so we've just been laughing that in many ways our 6 months of being married has felt more like 2 or 3 years just based on the last couple
Yes.
of months. But we've
Yeah.
been talking a lot about how this will shape our marriage for years to come. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering, what do you suspect will be some of the lingering good from this time, or has
Mm-hmm.
the possibility to be lingering good? And
Mm-hmm.
what do you think might be some of the lingering trauma from this time for
Mm-hmm.
marriages and for partnerships?
Yeah, really good question. I think that, both for Lisa and I, but also for other couples, that we're in relationship with or connection with, but also that I work with, I think the goodness, honestly, is that it has, we can use the word required, but I would also say imposed the sense of time together. That there are parts of one another, I think, that we are learning that we might not have known otherwise.
Mm,
The lingering at the dinner table, a little bit longer, a game or two at the
mhm,
table, a walk down the driveway. I think moments of connection between couples has really been heightened, potentially for the health and benefit and goodness for one another. And I don't think that's maybe as celebrated in the midst of what is so difficult in our time, is that we actually have more time together. And I know for many couples that can actually create more tension, more conflict, more disruptions. Statistically, that's true, but also for some, it has heightened this level of intimacy that might not have been offered or experienced otherwise. So
mm,
it has created new rhythms, in the ways couples connect, rhythms around structure of time, engagement of play that I don't think would have been not just possible before, but might not have been experienced otherwise. So I think the goodness of time together and learning and relearning and imagining, but also experiencing ways to connect that we might not have done otherwise. I think the piece about trauma or lingering effects, I think there is something to be really said for the ways in which our voice, our time impacts the way in which we relate to one another. So I think I would honestly say there are times that I have not been kind to Lisa in the last 6 weeks. I mean, not that I was not unkind before, but tone of voice. I think people are just shorter with one another, not as tolerant, not as patient. And I think the overarching umbrella of kindness and the lack of kindness at times, I think that's the part that for many couples they may need to return to. That the lingering tone of voice, the disruption around lack of patience, I think those are the pieces that will and need to be returned to at some point. For every couple that's different around when, but I don't think we have been as kind in this period of time that we could have been or needed to have been. And I think that's true for many couples. They just don't have the level of patience and endurance. I don't think we were hardwired to be together 24/7. I mean, as much as many couples would like to be, there is something in the, okay, I need to go work in the shed for a while. I need to be in the garage for a while. I need to be outside for a while. I need to read my book for a while. And the lack of space and the lack of distance, I think, just naturally creates tension for couples.
Oh gosh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to remind you of just a rich chapter in your book where you talk about shame scripts. And what Becky and I have found is that there's more sweetness between us during the season, and at times shame is much more intensified as we look at our 401k. There's so much worry and so much question about the future as we even try to occasionally get close to the grief we feel about not being with our children and our grandchildren. And shame has just come far more to the surface. Is that just us, or do you find that true for you, for others, that there's a volatility to this era, and in that volatility, shame seems to seep in far more than it, not that it didn't before, but it feels like it's much more part of our volatility.
Yeah, I would agree. I think part of what happens within shame, especially in this time period, is that there's so much exposure to one another. We can't hide. There's this sense of you literally see every part of me, and in that, I think that just naturally creates this sense of I don't feel or think or believe something that's very good about myself. And so I think shame, yes, creeps in both in the external pieces, like what you said, savings and the lack of time with other people, and especially family, but specifically with our spouses, I think there's something in the ways in which we relate and interact with one another that only promote and invite levels of shame that we might not have endured before.
Yeah.
So exposure, I think, is a really key piece. The exposure of being with one another extensively, for some, is really wonderful and delightful. And for others, it only reminds myself of where I fall short and what is not okay with me and about me. And that's part of, I think, for many couples, at least in the clinical world, that's part of our dialogue and our interaction, is paying attention to the way in which shame scripts are impacting our daily interaction, what it is that we speak to ourselves about ourselves, and heightening the awareness of that.
I know I heard someone recently say, and I've heard this a few different times, that a pretty comprehensive crisis like this is not so much a character growing time as it is a character revealing time. And I
Absolutely.
would imagine many people feel that sense of just the rough edges of us being more exposed and having less margin to kind of, be activated in the moment to behave differently. And that's just really helpful to think about the impact of shame in those moments and how that rarely leads us to like better decisions of how we relate.
Absolutely. I really like that imagery, rough edges. I think that's so true. What is the rough edge of one another being revealed? And I think for many of us, we're terrified of that being revealed because of the judgment, both from our spouse, but also toward ourselves. Is here it is again. Here it is again. This is a part of me I don't want you to see, and yet we can't hide in it. I think that's the bind for so many of us. It's as if you're seeing all of me 24/7 at all times, and there's just something so freaking exposing about that.
Well, I haven't put words to it the way you're doing, and it's so helpful to hear two things. We're more powerless than we've ever been.
Absolutely.
Simultaneously, we're more exposed than we've ever been. And the combination, look, I feel shame the moment I feel powerless, let alone when I'm exposed in the powerlessness in a season where we really don't know anything about what's going to happen other than the sense it's not going to get better for a long season. So even our forms of false, the illusions that there are quick cures and a vaccine, nothing's going to take us out of this quickly. And so when you think about how to engage those shame scripts that are operating always, but heightened in this process, what are you and Lisa finding to engage that, to begin to at least name it, if not then engage it to change it?
I think what you just said, Dan, is really helpful, that in the midst of feeling or being powerless, it promotes and I think creates and invites just a natural state of anxiety for most, if not all of us, that there's something wrong with me that I can't make happen what I need to make happen. And when we feel that, there is just a natural part of us that feels anxiety, distress, a little bit of worry, that what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen next week. And I think I really want to highlight that of course that the powerlessness that we feel heightens and drives the anxiety that we feel, because that's a natural human response to something that is taken from us. When we feel powerlessness, that we just naturally feel anxious. What I would say, though, is that in the midst of this moment, like when we feel anxiety and distress, specifically with regard to what we're experiencing, I think this is where I would almost want to say that the gift of what we're experiencing is that we for one another in our marriage get to be the image of God in the midst of what is creating so much distress and worry, that we are naturally invited to move toward one another, how we soothe one another, how we remind one another of what is true, but also just the comfort of presence without words. That even in the midst of those shame scripts or the distress that we're feeling or the worry that we're experiencing, there is just something potentially really beautiful around the comfort of potentially what our spouse can offer, and just simply the presence of, I'm here with you, we've got this, I know this is distressful, I know this is worrisome, and I'm with you in this. And I think that's the comfort that we all long for without having to ask for, that is really needed in moments like this.
Well, we're right in between, in many ways, the choice between comfort or contention. And when I'm in contention with Becky, even I know 80% of the time that I'm wrong and that I'm foolish, but it feels like, at least when I get angry, I have a return to some degree of power. But that's so bound into my own shame, provoked by my own shame, like I won't be able to provide for my wife. in this time. And I'm creating debris in the moment that increases my sense of shame. So I've got an ancient shame script I have to provide. And I'm failing even in the moment. So it feels like the doubling up of the war of powerlessness, then shame, then handling it poorly and having more shame. And so that question of how are you and Lisa, how would you counsel your own soul, let alone others, to engage shame in a different way in this season?
I think one of the most helpful and intentional ways, at least that we are beginning to discover, is that we don't really have at this moment the option to hide in our shame, literally. That this moment in time, I think, has potentially created new patterns, even for Lisa and I, that to be intentional about naming shame, to be intentional about speaking shame, that we might not have done prior, that I have nowhere to run, literally. I have nowhere to go. I can't hide in my shed. I can't hide outside. I can't go away for a period of time. I do think the vulnerability of for some couples and for Lisa and I around exposure to shame is actually really life-giving in a way that when I choose to have the courage, which is not always true, but when I choose to have the courage to name what it is I'm tempted to believe about myself in this moment, and Lisa moves toward me in that, I think that's by design. I mean, that's actually what we would hope for. Whereas I think in the past, I might not have felt the freedom or the invitation to name and to put words to it. And same for Lisa. I think that's time together only reminds one another of what it is that we believe about ourselves. And I think that's for many couples that can be both disruptive but also life-giving at the same time.
And Rachel, same question to you. How are you and Michael engaging shame?
Well, I mean, like I said, we're in a very new marriage with a lot of transition also at such a time as this. And I think we're learning so much about each other and have a deep commitment to keep learning and be curious. And, I'm very fortunate that my husband has gone through similar work as I have. So we have a common language, which I think is probably somewhat rare to have a common language to engage shame, like to even know how to talk about shame. So I'm not at all saying we've done that perfectly. I'm a very robust woman. So like when I feel shame, it's not quiet. And, I have this recent example, which I talked about in our podcast about rituals, but our sump pump broke in our basement. And it was kind of my fault. And the sewage backed up into our shower. And because it's the time of COVID, it took several days for someone to be able to come fix it. So lots of carrying buckets up and downstairs. And I really did. I felt so much shame. And Michael was so kind to just move toward me. But I also was like, I kind of need you to punish me because that actually with my shame scripts would feel better. And so I was just picking fights out the wazoo, like just fight me. That will feel more soothing. Fight me, and at one point he just was like, I actually don't need that from you. And I would like to be able to offer you comfort, but if that's not going to be helpful right now, then I'm happy to give you space. And it just was like something in me, I think it actually brought me to a deeper awareness of myself, that there's just still such a war I have with needing comfort. But in my stories, in my childhood stories, comfort was the last thing available in the midst of shame. And so it's a whole new learning curve. I know how to soothe myself by myself. And I think that's a little bit what you're getting at, Steve, with this sense of like, I don't necessarily have the luxury right now to like go on a 3-day retreat and like get my head right and feel grounded and kind of take care of myself so that in my head, I'm more able to be metabolized. I'm less rough. I'm less rough edges. I'm softer and kinder and nicer and ultimately feel more worthy of love. And so how do I let someone move toward me in the place where I feel the most unworthy of love? And it's just kind of undone me, to be honest with you. It is, I think it will be my life's work in our marriage
Mm-hmm.
to be able to receive kindness and tenderness in the places I feel like that's the last thing I deserve.
I think what
So
you just said, Rachel, is really helpful, that the very thing we need, which is comfort and kindness and tenderness and empathy, I think at a core know we need, and yet hate that we need. And that's the war. I think that's the war in this time, is our spouse has that privilege to be able to offer that, and yet the very thing that is able to be offered, we hate that we need. And so that, I think that's, for many of us, that feels like what you just said. That's the process that we're in this moment.
Well, for couples that resolve that by distracting themselves, individual projects, separate parts of the house, maybe a commonality of watching a screen. This is a season where trauma always exposes. Exposure always leads to a revelation of shame. So if people don't have language to engage shame, they're going to just think their spouse is crazy, or they feel crazy, or things are just, of course, not normal. So you can pile it up at the level of, well, what did you expect? This is a crazy moment, rather than having what you're putting words to, and that is, can we language on behalf of ourselves and our spouse that so much is going on that we've got to allow ourselves to step into that vulnerable conversation about loss, about fear, about shame, that feels like that's so much more work. How can I do that given that everything else around me is blinding me to that level of engagement? And yet what we're really arguing is, look, if you don't do that work, you're going to have even more debris than you could ever hope to dig out of 6 weeks, 6 months from now. And so you've got an opportunity in this context to do work that you have to do given the exigencies and the crisis of this hour. And so when you invite people and your own heart to ask, how are you making it through this? What's sustaining you, Steve, through this process with Lisa and just your own life and heart?
I think the sustaining piece is what you just named, is that we're in a place not just of requirement, but invitation. We're invited. It might feel required, but we're invited to be able to put words to, what is it like for you to be in a place of fear and worry and concern? And what is it like for you that something has been taken from you without consent? And how is that familiar for you in your own story? Parts of our own stories that are revealed in this time that might not have been revealed in this type of way before. I think that's the privilege and invitation that we have, to be aware of, who are you in the midst of this crisis that I might not have known otherwise? And my hope, I think, for Lisa and I and people I work with, but also for one another, is that what if we dare to believe that this is actually a time that draws us toward one another rather than moves us away from one another? Yes. That as I discover something about Lisa that I might not have discovered before, there is delight in that. And I do think that's part of what we might lose sight of. But yet, like you just said, Dan, there's a requirement / invitation to move toward and forward to one another in the midst of this, rather than away.
Well, what a privilege to be with you both, because I look at both your marriages, one of 6 months and one of 35 years. And you two, and I say two, meaning two marriages, you two fight.
Yours as well.
I'll join you, and to say all three of us know that we have conflict, and there are many moments it just does not go terribly well. Yet the willingness to stay in it, to know that marriage is more than getting along, but in fact the redemptive crucible that invites us to the relationship we most desire, and that's the relationship with Jesus. And so our marriages force us, call us, invite us, demand. I don't know what the word is between that to say, I need more. I need more grace. I need more care, tenderness. I need to offer more grace and tenderness.
Mm-hmm.
So this gift that you invite us to, Steve, I can say what a privilege to be able to work with you and to produce this online course that we'll be inviting people to and having you back on the podcast as we get closer to that launch. But thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rachel, for bringing your marriages and your spouses into our conversation today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the both of you. And it's always an honor to have a conversation. Thank you.
Likewise.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.